Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for New American Security. My name is Derek Johnson. I am a reporter at Cyberscoop. I've been covering cybersecurity and AI since before 2022 in the ChatGPT explosion, but probably like a lot of you, I've been paying a lot more closer attention to it since then. Let me see if I can set our discussion up here real quick, and then I'll introduce you to our audience and our panelists, and we will get started here. Because I do think we're actually in a pretty interesting place with AI in the cybersecurity field and the technology. I think there's still challenges, and we're going to talk about some of those challenges to make these tools more affordable, to make them more cost-effective and efficient to the point where we can use them more broadly. But we are seeing some interesting developments. We now have large language models that can lead the leaderboards of bug bounty companies like HackerOne. Certainly there are some limitations with those models, but we're seeing some interesting things on the defensive side. And then on the offensive side, my reporting and from the sources that I've seen, I think we're still seeing malicious hackers use this technology to make their existing attack chains more efficient. They're not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but we're going to get into that with some of our guests here today. And I'll introduce him now. So I have, direct to the left of me, I have Caleb Withers. He's a research associate for the Technology and National Security Program here at the Center for the New American Security. He's also the author of a report that was put out back in September titled Tipping the Scales, Emerging AI Capabilities and the Cyber Offense-Defense Balance. And so we're going to be talking about a couple of the things that he's teed up here in his report. Around affordability and inference costs and things like that that are relevant. Next to him, we have Andrew Lohn, who's a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where he leads the CyberAI team. Andrew has also served as Director of Emerging Technologies on the National Security Council during the Biden administration. And then finally, we have Chris Rohlf, who is a security engineer at Meta. And he's also a non-resident research fellow at CSET. So welcome, everybody. Appreciate it. I'm going to jump into my questions, but really do want this to be an interactive discussion. We do have the ability to, for you all to send. I don't know if they put here the thing. There should be a way for you to send in questions, and if you do, I'll get them here, and I'll be able to fold them into the discussion as we go. So. Getting started, Caleb, let's start with some of the findings that you had in your report. You kind of come down on the side of seeing this current moment as being one that favors offense more than defense, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you think that and what you think some of the drivers are for that conclusion.
Yeah, sure thing. So what I try to do in the aforementioned report that I just put out is to make the case that thinking about the advantage of emerging AI capabilities for offenders versus defenders is a useful and worthwhile way to think about things. And I think where I was coming from that is that sometimes some of the discussion I see about the cyber capabilities of AI models will sort of say, okay, the AI models can now do X, Y, Z, scary or concerning thing. And I mean, that's interesting and notable, but also, the history of machine learning or software or just tools in general that can do dual use things in the cyber domain, that's not a new thing. And if attackers can use something and defenders can use something, the fact that a certain capability is out there, it's not inherently concerning. On the other hand, I think I also see sort of people sometimes say, well, okay, we don't have to worry about anything. Like, we'll just make sure the defenders can also use these AI tools, and then that's going to be great. Everything's going to be fine. Nothing's going to change. So I think paying attention to how much these tools are going to help attackers versus defenders is something to pay attention to. And then the next thing my report sort of looks at is, okay, there's a lot of hype around these so-called frontier AI models, large language models, the sort of models powering ChatGPT and whatnot. Is there actually a there in terms of how they might help attackers or defenders in a different way than we've seen, machine learning and software tools in the past. And I think there is potentially some there's there. One of the things I look at is that these models are even as the cost to run a given capability keeps going down and down and down, the amount that it can make sense to spend on running these models, the returns to spending more to run bigger models for longer, that sort of thing, seems to be going up. And so that challenges some of the economics for most software tools where it's actually pretty cheap to run, and that's great for defenders, because if you're a cyber defender, you have a large attack surface, something that you can sort of scale up at near zero marginal cost. That's great for you, and if that assumption starts to be challenged, that's something to pay attention to. Another thing I point to is that, very nascent, not there yet in a big way, but these models are sort of starting to show some promise at not just being able to automate parts of the cyber kill chain, but maybe sort of do the whole thing, or at least help you work through the whole thing. And if and when we start to see that sort of capability for increasingly sophisticated attacks, that changes the equation a little bit too, because there's the sort of quote or saying that cyber attacks are tactically fast. They unfold ultimately at machine speed, but operationally slow in terms of the human labor and effort to do those. And so if that starts to be challenged, the tempo of cyber attack and defense starts to change maybe. Another thing, a final thing that the report looks at is that, this is somewhat of a subjective claim, but when the models are good, like on a good day, they can do some pretty impressive things, but they're pretty surprisingly, even perhaps relative to what people expected, unreliable. And so, tools that can be really good on a good day but maybe can't be relied on overall, and I can get into this, I think there's some reasons to think that might be more of a concern for defenders who might not be able to tolerate that sort of unreliability, whereas if you're an attacker trying to get into a system, something that doesn't get you into the system most of the time but occasionally does a really good job at getting you in, that's pretty useful. So the slight caveat I'd offer to your framing is not even necessarily saying that on balance I think that the AI capabilities we're seeing are going to favour offenders, but that there's some reasons to think we might see this, and therefore from a policymaker perspective, this is something we want to pay attention to, and also ultimately that it's not predetermined, right? These are things that can be affected on the margin with decisions about research and development and policy.
Yeah, we're going to get into some of your findings around affordability and reliability. I want to give both Chris and Andrew an opportunity just to kind of set up their own thoughts about how they see the offense-defense balance. I do want to point out, so if you do want to submit a question, you can do so. There's a chat box on the live website. You can also do so on socials by using hashtag CNAS2025. And you can get your question into us that way as well. So we'll start with Chris. Why don't you tell us kind of how you see the current state of offense-defense balance when it comes to AI?
Sure. I think no matter where you stand on this issue, it's important that make sure that we're all speaking the same language in terms of where cyber starts off today, like without AI. There's this concept called the defender's dilemma, which basically means the defender has to be right all of the time, and the attacker only has to be right a small number of times. And so cyber is just asymmetrically in the attacker's favor. And so they're not really starting off on a level playing field when adopting AI to start with. And so the way I look at this question about the asymmetry now with the emergence of AI, like through that lens. And I think if I give the same dual use capability to an attacker and a defender, who gains more out of it? That's how I look at the question. And to me, I think long term, at least theoretically, the defender gains far more, mainly because costs for attackers are so incredibly low today, and the success rate is so incredibly high. Defenders are bottlenecked by talent, by cost, so on and so forth. And so when I look at that same dual use capability, I just see significantly more potential for uplift for the defender. But I think there's a lot of factors that might make that not become a reality. I think you touch on some of these in the report, right? Like cost is one of them, adoption, right? I think the classic example I give is, most people have lost an account to like credential stuffing attacks before, right? Where you lose access to your email because you reuse the same password somewhere else. But there's foolproof defenses to that in two-factor authentication. So what happened? It's adoption, right? That known foolproof defense wasn't adopted. And it's the same case here, where even if we have tremendous uplift for defense through AI, if there isn't a large-scale diffusion of that capability across the industry, across the long tail of charities and hospitals and small to medium businesses that need to adopt that technology, then that uplift won't be realized. But I think the potential is there, certainly long-term, to benefit the defense far more than offense.
I would like to disagree with both of the panelists to make for an interesting panel, but unfortunately, I don't think I can. Maybe I can I can add a little bit of color, though. And so I wrote a paper not that long ago about cyber offense-defense balance, too. And what I tried to do there was dig into what makes cyber what it is, kind of what both of our panelists have mentioned. Chris mentioned the defender's dilemma, and Caleb mentioned tactically fast, operationally slow. And there are bunches of these things. In addition to defender's dilemma, there are some advantages that defenders have. They can set the terrain however they would like. They are legally justifiable. They're not like on the outskirts having to hide around. But attackers have other advantages too. I went and scoured the literature from what people have said for decades, and there's I had 9 different things for why defenders have advantages, 9 why attackers have advantage, and then another 50 different things about what makes cyber what it is. Things like the tactically fast, the operationally slow. And then went through how does AI change all of these different things, and then tried to condense that down. And came to 42 different things that AI will change, and I'm not going to list all those out here.
Please do.
Yeah, but what I did just a couple days ago is I tried to just look at them in my own way. I don't trust my shuffling, but I just said, which of these are more important than others? Which help offense? Which help defense? Which are unclear? And what I came to, I just looked at the top 20 before coming out here, and of the top 20, I had 8 in the column of helps defenders. I had 3 in the columns of help offense, and then I had 7 in the columns of a column of depends on what we do. We have a choice, and then a couple that are unclear. And so what I think that leads to, that agrees with what both of them said, is there is stuff that helps with offense and there's stuff that helps with defense. There's a good reason to think that this helps defense more, but there's a lot of stuff that depends on what we do, and we can screw this up in a way that makes offense more advantaged than defense. It's not guaranteed that defense has a going-in head start, perhaps, but offense can get an opportunity if we mess it up. Some things that we have that are good for defenders is that there's a whole bunch of easy things. You don't have to be that creative to do defense. The problem is just there's lots of things to do. There's lots of guidance. There's lots of standards that you have to adhere to. If you miss any of those holes, then attackers have a shot. So that's not such a hard problem. AI can do some of that. That helps defense. Some stuff that helps offense is if it starts getting good at finding vulnerabilities that are hard to patch, things like hardware vulnerabilities, like Meltdown Inspector that we had a while back, or some things that I know Chris is interested in the trusted computing centers of these chips. But some of the things that we have a choice on are things like, do we put vulnerable AI systems in our infrastructure, things that we know aren't that reliable? How do we certify code that we put in, whether it's vibe coded or and so we have choices on those matters that can lead us towards defense or offense. I'll pause there.
Yeah, and so let's go back to this question of inference costs, because I do think that on the defensive side presents probably one of the bigger current challenges that we're facing, which is that even as some of these models have gotten a lot better at doing things like finding and patching vulnerabilities, they cost too much to run. And an example is a company that I covered, Expo, which has a large language model that does nothing but search for vulnerabilities and patch them all day long. And they're really excited about it, and they're trying to get those inference costs down. But right now it costs more to run that program than the bounties that it's actually winning. And so I think that gives you an idea of how much compute resources are necessary for some of these models to work. Can you all we'll start off again with you, Caleb, because it's a subject in your report. Talk about where these models are right now in terms of their accessibility to society, and what needs to happen for these technologies to become more accessible in the future.
Yeah, I'll offer a few thoughts here. I mean, I think one is, as you point out, there's a whole lot of interesting stuff you can do interesting research results if you're willing to throw massive and massive amounts of, compute at seeing what these models can do. And then I think it's, you're very right to point out that from the perspective of adoption, how much it costs is super important. And so I think this is something important to look at in evaluations, for example. I think it's important to get, human baselines in general for some of the evaluations we're doing here, but also, look at human evaluations in the terms of cost. Is it actually worth doing something with, an AI model or with a human using an AI model and all that sort of thing. One thing I would say, though, is I think it seems to hold pretty reliably that anything that an AI model can actually properly do at some point, now, the costs to doing that seem to be going down at something like 10 to 100 times a year, depending on what exactly you're looking at and how you're measuring it. So I think there is actually a lot of value in seeing what can be done at the moment expensively. It's sort of like a little bit of a way to see the future in terms of, well, if AI can't do something at the moment, it's a little bit of a fool's errand to speculate it will be able to do that at XYZ time frame. But if an AI model can do it at the moment, it's just expensive. I think that maybe provides a little bit more of a grounded chance to look into the future. So a couple of thoughts on that question.
Is it just a matter of building more compute resources, more data centers? Is the because even as we are building up more capacity, we are finding more and more ways to use that capacity. So does the challenge go beyond just kind of building more data centers, or is it more than that?
I mean, yeah, I think it's a mix of things, and places like Epoch, for example, do good research into of the cost trends, how much is driven by more efficient and cheap compute versus algorithmic improvements in the models themselves versus innovations, and actually the term scaffolding is used in sort of how can we take the models we have and use them intelligently. So I mean, the answer is it's a mix. I also think because it's a mix, that's why I think it's reasonable to some degree of confidence, extrapolate into the future a little bit, because you say, okay, even if NVIDIA stopped putting out better chips tomorrow, okay, we probably would still see algorithmic improvements, even if we, hit some walls or entered a bit of a AI winter in terms of where the capabilities of these models are going. Probably the chips are still going to get better, and even if sort of none of these things happen in terms of us learning how to make do with what we can with these models. I mean, there's been some good results where one developer will put out a model and say, we found it couldn't do anything on this benchmark. And then another developer will come out and say, well, actually, we gave it access to a scratch pad and some, tools, and it was able to do some things. So yeah, lots of somewhat uncorrelated drivers of progress here. I think that will continue to drive costs down, at least over the coming years, medium term.
Yeah. Chris, how do you see this? Just as someone who's you're in a large company, you probably get a good look at how these things are used on an enterprise level on both sides. Where do you see kind of this cost discussion and affordability for organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier about adoption, right? If the cost is too high, then adoption will be low. I do think the cost is still too high, but I think it's important to remember that there are different use cases in cyber for AI, right? It's not like you tell the model, like, go do cyber for me. Like, there's vulnerability discovery, there's vulnerability fixing, there's like authorization and authentication challenges, right? You can use the model in a sort of classic classifier mode, you can use it in a generative mode, and each of these things costs a different amount of tokens. And it depends on how big your infrastructure is, right? I don't worry too much about the big tech companies because they already understand scale and cost and they can bring these things down. But certainly, there's a higher cost to things like vulnerability discovery than there is, like malware analysis, just for example, right? Like just a smaller amount of data depending on the company. And then there's like the agentic workloads that you have the model drive. And right now, if you look across the industry, at least in vulnerability discovery and mitigation patching, which is an area I'm very close and familiar with, what I see happening is a trend where we're using these models to drive sort of like classic methods for vulnerability discovery, right? We're using them in these agentic loops to drive things like a fuzzer, drive static analysis engines. And so basically you just give the model a certain number of iterations, and you just say like, I want to generate a fuzzing harness for this piece of code. Do that until it works, and you give it a finite number of iterations it's allowed to run, a finite number around of tokens it's allowed to generate. But once it hopefully succeeds in that task, it basically offloads the work to cheap CPU and scales out. And I think that is probably going to remain true for the foreseeable future, even as compute gets better and model architectures improve. I still see this as something that a trend that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. But there are some like early signs, particularly in some of the frontier AI labs have released around security review tools, where they're not using agentic workflows. They're actually just passing the code into the model and allowing the model to reason over it. And their precision and recall is like really, really good. The problem is that it costs significantly more tokens to do. But it's encouraging to see, at least at the frontier level, that we're heading in that direction. But I think it will be some time before that is seen widely across the industry.
Andrew, you want
to? Yeah. So I guess I might start this by saying I think cost is an important thing to think about, but I'm also kind of on a campaign to think about it less. I think it gets too much attention, and there are a couple of reasons I might try to pitch into here. One of them is that attack and defense at like a tactical, the cyber dogfighting level, they don't have the same ability to spend. Like attackers don't have a GPU that they can use on somebody's vulnerable machine. If they hack into an ICS controller for the water grid, they can't just run a huge model on their GPU that takes 8 GPU. It's not there to be run. Defenders can. They just have a GPU off the side. And so defenders have the opportunity to spend, and attackers don't even have. And if they wanted to go faster, you probably wouldn't even want to. You could pull all this data out and run that, but then you're going to get flagged also. And so attack at that tactical level is constrained in some ways. But there are all kinds of other things, like Chris was mentioning, that would happen offset that aren't part of that dogfight bit. But even there, I wonder how much attackers are constrained. If we bring down cost, does that really increase number of attacks? Attacks are already pretty cheap. Are people going to be more inclined to attack if it's a little bit cheaper or even a lot bit cheaper? I don't think that's the long pole in the attacker motivations. I think that there are other things that might be important from an AI perspective even. Some of them might be lower barrier to entry. Like, why are so many of the cyber criminals coming out of Russia? Like 70% of things are going to, I don't think it's because the money is more valuable in Russia. I think it's because they have access to some technical expertise, perhaps. They have protection from the government. They're not going to get thrown in jail or struck by missiles. And another thing that we might think about from a motivation that could be a long pole is that at like a nation state level, they have some campaign they want to run, but they want to time it with like, if they're running tanks across the border, and they're going to do that in 2 days, can they get their cyber operation ready to go in those 2 days? Right now, maybe not. If AI is faster, maybe, but that's a different thing than cost. And I think these are the types of factors that are really the long pole in a lot of offensive cases.
And maybe to add some flavor to what Andrew just said, I mean, whether you call it cost or maybe some things just like attention or capacity or whatnot, I mean, I do think there is a thing now where a lot of the times if you see some report, someone got hacked, the report will then come out and say, yeah, it turns out they were vulnerable for quite a while, the front door was open, so to speak, and it was just that no one had sort of, bothered to actually poke at the door and see if it was open. And so whether you call it, maybe it's not cost itself, but maybe, it's more of this adoption, diffusing, understanding, sort of being able to scale up operations. I do think something to pay attention to is that we're in a world of a lot of cyber vulnerability at the moment, and the extent that people suffer the consequences of this vulnerability, I think maybe is, a lot of the time, at least for less sophisticated attacks, more to do with just getting lucky or the limited attention of attackers or whatnot. And so I think that is something to pay attention to, that if some things that are not so hard, but still require an attacker to actually bother to do it if they don't even really need to bother to do it in future, if they can just say, actually it is cheap or straightforward enough to just try and hit everything that's vulnerable to this. I think this is a trend to pay attention to over the coming years.
Andrew, I know that we were kind of chatting a bit back in the green room about looking at how AI models can be used in offensive ways and how they can be exploited. And we kind of talked a little bit about how it seems like we're both not so much concerned necessarily with AI being used in the attack chain as we are AI presenting an attack surface in and of itself, right? Because we have all of these organizations and entities and individuals that are integrating AI technologies into their normal business operations, their normal IT operations in ways that they don't necessarily quite understand or they don't understand how to do in a secure manner. Sometimes these models can react in ways we don't anticipate or in ways that can expose that vulnerability even further. Talk about that a little bit, because I think when we talk about using AI for offense, it's usually about using the AI to attack and not attacking the AI to get in.
Yeah, this has been a big topic for several years within the AI security world. It was more common, popular, people talk about adversarial examples in image processing systems. It seems like people are mostly familiar with that. And we didn't solve it. It's not as popular to do research on, or at least the terms have changed, but not because we fixed it. Just we're like, well, I guess that's a thing that exists. And those types of vulnerabilities still exist in LLM systems. And I'll say this, and people can fire back at me, but I try to think, how hard is it to get past the guardrails in these systems, that the best systems that are being even served out into the world as real production systems. And when I think about it, I think like, well, children break them for fun. And like the level of security, I try to think of what's a security equivalent of it. It's like maybe a 2-letter password is kind of what I'm thinking. And I don't get too much pushback on that idea. We'll see what Chris says. But if that's the level of security we're thinking when we put these models out, that how easily they can be manipulated with prompt injections or something like that cause them to have malicious behavior, that's a lot of vulnerability to be incorporating into our production systems. It's not such a big deal if you're not building something that people are going to try to manipulate or hack, but for anything that has that needs to be reliable in the face of an adversary, that's a big problem. On the same side, I kind of like to put that vulnerability in our cyber defensive systems. If we're using AI to defend, that can be manipulated also, and it can make errors just from a reliability standpoint, not being forced into an error. I'd kind of like to add a little bit of color to Caleb's intro, where he mentioned this about the defense needing to be reliable and the attacker not needing to be that reliable. The attacker can fire a bunch of times at it and not worry about it. If the defensive system takes some sort of action, changes a configuration, or you might end up with blue screen of deaths and all of your planes grounded, the way we did a couple years ago from a defensive update. If we're updating many times faster with a less reliable system, we should expect that to happen more often, unless we take the decisions to make sure that the systems that we integrate are reliable.
Yeah, I'll definitely chime in on this. Prompt injections, if you're not familiar, right, it's basically just the model taking untrusted inputs from some agentic workflow and combining them with a trusted input, right? So if you have an agent that has the ability, for example, to read your email and then book a vacation for you, it's going out to the internet, it's grabbing lots of untrusted content, and it's mixing it in its context window with the trusted content from your email. And it's actually fairly fascinating problem, because it's the exact same problem we've had pre-AI for decades, is that the CPU in your computer does not know the difference between code and data. It's the exact same problem. And I do think that this will certainly get worse before it gets better for these agentic systems. There's some promising research around like model architectures to try to separate these two. But just as we haven't solved this in hardware for the last 30 years, I'm not bullish or confident that we'll solve this in model architectures anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that there's like no hope. A lot of these systems can be secured through like classic system isolation means, least privilege, like things we've relied on for decades to secure systems. I think a potentially even maybe bigger risk is the models creating attack surface faster than our ability to secure it. And what I mean by that is for these agentic workflows to be valuable, they generally have to like create code, or they're, someone's like vibe coding, for example, and they're adding that to a product, except they're doing it at 10x the productivity they were before they had this tool available to them. So they're producing 10x the code. Is your defensive team keeping up on 10x the amount of code going into your code repos? It depends, right? It all comes back to this question of adoption. But it's certainly a real risk that it could create more attack surface, and we just won't be able to keep up with the pace of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in an audience question, and I'll remind you all on the live CNAS website, there will be a chat box where you can put the question in. You can also go on social and use hashtag CNAS2025 with your question. The first question we have in comes from Caitlin, who asks, how are U.S. adversaries employing AI to advance their cyber operations, and what can the U.S. do to defend against these threats? I'll just talk a little bit about from my reporting. It is largely the way that I sort of described it at the Open, and that comes from U.S. intelligence agencies who have essentially, found that China, Russia, Iran, that they are using AI, but not necessarily in ways that is dramatically changing the cybersecurity landscape. It's more about scaling and speed. I do think deepfakes and things like that have gotten a lot better and pose a particular problem in our information environment currently. But I'll open it up to the panel as well, and you all can kind of let me know how you see it.
I can go first on this. Certainly not seeing any paradigm shift in offensive capabilities from AI based on public and private reporting and threat intelligence. Like was mentioned earlier by Caleb, like all these capabilities are dual use. And so you can imagine the way defenders are using the models for like vulnerability discovery, for example, attackers are using it in the exact same way. And there's some great public reporting. I think OpenAI's put out some stuff, Google's put out some stuff over the last couple of years that show existing APT groups that are like very well known. We understand their tooling. We already track them across the ecosystem, across all these technical tech platforms. And you can see the prompts that have been published in some of these reports and how they're using these tools. They're using them in the exact same way that I see defenders using them. Like, help me write this script a little bit faster. Is this piece of code vulnerable? It's like an efficiency tool. And I will just point back to Andrew's comments earlier. The cost of attack is already so low. The toolkits are already mature. The success rates are already very, very high. And so it's unclear how much of an advantage AI would actually give those actors today above and beyond their existing capabilities and the access and the low cost that they already enjoy.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with all of that and say we're starting to see people using stuff experimentally. It's maybe slower than I would have expected based on what we were knowing that people could do even years ago, and it hasn't been very threatening. In the disinformation space, that people have also, like OpenAIs and Anthropics have said, how is our stuff being used? And most of that's also been not that scary, with not that much uptake. There's one thing that's also not scary yet, but that I think is maybe worth watching that would go a little bit underrated, is that Anthropic noted that one of the disinformation operations was not just using the AI to create disinformation. Everybody kind of understands that. They were using it to build out their the business side of the operation of doing disinformation, to build the accounts, to build out the infrastructure that you might launch these information operations from. You can imagine that in cyber also, where the bigger issue is not actually AI for cyber, but AI for doing the back end stuff that you don't really think about, which is often the bigger piece of a cyber operation in told.
Yeah, well, one area that I think we haven't touched on is, and that I'm hearing a little bit more about more and more these days, is we are building out a tremendous amount of data center capacity. A lot of it is, of course, being earmarked for this planned expansion of AI. And at what point does that particular infrastructure itself become a doorway into disrupting a multi-billion-dollar industry within the United States. Does that something that ever concerns you or worries you if you look at AI as critical infrastructure or the critical infrastructure that supports AI? Does that become a target in and of itself?
It depends on what value that infrastructure is providing and whether an adversary to the United States, how they view it. One scenario I often throw out there, just to be provocative, is the idea that, like, let's say that AI does overwhelmingly benefit defenders, and cybersecurity is a solved problem 10 years from now. I know it's a stretch, but let's say that happens. Like, what happens to all of the signals intelligence that depends on cyber capabilities today? Like, suddenly we might find ourselves in a world where adversaries no longer have cheap, easy access into, visibility into what their adversaries are thinking. Now, suddenly, one state has a complete security monopoly due to AI. And so, like, that's one example where that infrastructure might, create an issue where an adversary feels that it's a threat to them and they have to do something about it. You can imagine other scenarios too, right? Tech platforms that are just sort of taking off economically and shutting others out, right? This is a soft power between, between states. But certainly intellectual property concerns, all these things we've always worried about in cybersecurity and defending will clearly continue to be of concern in the era of AI.
Yeah, I'd also say, I think, yeah, totally worth something paying attention to. There's also the context sort of the providers of these data centers have been doing impressive things to up the security, also sort of maybe not coming from a running start on the scale of sort of like a decade or two, in the sense that, GPUs, AI chips, originally were largely used for sort of gaming or generating graphics and whatnot. So the value of sort of baking in security really early into the process there, there wasn't really a case for that much, a decade or two ago, and there is now. So, probably in some areas there's some, catch up to be done. Another way I sort of think about it is, there's this open question of, as we were sort of talking about, what does the future look like? Maybe it looks pretty similar to now. Maybe there's some chance that AI proves pretty transformative in the cyber domain and things look a little bit weird or different than we're used to. There's a thing where if we are in this world where AI proves to be really decisive and transformative for cyber capabilities sometime in the coming years, there's sort of a double whammy in the sense that, okay, these data centers are going to be really useful, but also will be, key targets. And so the pace of change might be a little bit higher than the counterfactual and these sorts of things. And so one way I think about this is, maybe it's premature to be doing a whole bunch of capital investment to make these data centers more secure than they, is actually justified at the moment, notwithstanding some of the more sensitive data centers that might be out there. But thinking about what are the sort of technological R&D we can be doing, or what's the sort of work that can be done at the standards level or the government working with industry level to sort of have some things in the back pocket that could be applied to, say, okay, what would like a truly more secure than we have now data center look like in the coming years? So I think that's a constructive place to focus attention, is not these massive outlays, but sort of what can we do in terms of R&D and discussion between the relevant parties to sort of prepare for these potential futures.
Great. That was kind of a hypothetical question, so let me go with like two kind of hypothetical answers. One from the models themselves as being a part of a type of infrastructure, and then one from the data centers being a part of infrastructure. The models can be poisoned. Like, it can be manipulated in training ways subversively. And it can be very difficult or nearly impossible to tell whether something like that has happened. So somebody could sneak their way into OpenAI or Anthropic or Google and mess with things a little bit, or models that are trained from less trusted adversaries might have stuff embedded in them that we'd like them to not have. And as we incorporate those models into all parts of infrastructure and all parts of operations, it's difficult to assess how much of a risk that could pose. The other one that I'd like to go from the data center side is there's been some thought and discussion in various circles about putting in licenses into our GPUs and our computing systems that could be turned off so that those things stop working if we want them to stop working. We should be very certain that those can't be subverted by a third party, and I'm currently not very certain that. So we might not even be worried about somebody finding vulnerability. We might just put the kill switches in to start with, and then yeah. And you wouldn't even necessarily have to have the vulnerability, but if you had a credible threat that you could kill all of our GPUs, that would be pretty useful from an international standpoint.
On the model side of things, to just say briefly, I think there's also a procurement thing here from the perspective of government in the sense that, they're using these models in the national security enterprise. There's probably some interesting things they could do if you, on the sort of cyber offense and defense side. And if you are procuring these models and you're saying to the, OpenAI or the developer or whoever, what confidence do you have that there's sort of not been poisoning or compromise of your training, but above and beyond the fact you're just scraping everything from the internet, which is inherently a bit of a not great starting point. But I think at the moment you're sort of relying on the assurances of these companies. Effectively, I think they're not going to reveal everything with full transparency in terms of IP. Here's the exact thing. Here's all the data. Here's all the process we did to train these models. And so again, on the R&D side, I think can developers make claims about their pipeline and what that means for the trustworthiness of their model in a way that doesn't reveal too much of that IP. I think that's a R&D direction that will be helpful for a greater degree of justified trust or not as these models are adopted in the national security enterprise.
Let's start bringing in some more audience questions. Do we have Peter here? Okay, so I'll just read Peter's question. It seems clear that one of the most considerable threats imposed by AI use is improved phishing capabilities, both in quality and scale. Can you tell us your perspectives on this issue? This is a low-level tool, but are there parallels on the defensive side?
Certainly, they can be used for better phishing emails. One of the counterintuitive things about phishing is that those typos are generally left in, and it's because it helps filter out the people who would never fall for this. It's kind of counterintuitive, but there's research into this. So even if you improve all of the typos and you make these emails look like a personalized spear phishing email tailored specifically for you, it's important to remember that even if you're using AI for better phishing, the defensive answer isn't like throw more AI at the defense against phishing. It's phishing-resistant authentication credentials, which we have in passkeys and other two-factor authentication today. It all goes back to adoption. If there's not widespread adoption of those defensive controls, then it doesn't really matter whether the attacker has AI or not for phishing. There are lots of great examples, though, I think, outside of phishing, where attackers may use AI to pull off a slightly better attack, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the defense has to use AI to defend against it.
Do we have anyone in the audience who has a question? If so, raise your hand. We'll get you a mic. Just let us know who you are and where you're from and ask away.
I'm Michael Nelson with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Been doing tech policy for a very long time, and the first thing I learned on the Hill was don't talk about problems where there aren't even a hint of solutions. You've done a good job of talking about the chips and the algorithms and some things and there are some solutions. And you just talked about authentication, one of my favorite topics. Unless I got here too late, I didn't hear insider threat. And that's something we almost never talk about because no one seems to know what to do about it.
You mean in terms of the model itself being...
No, somebody working for the company being
So an actual,
either
yeah.
Coerced or looking for the big bucks, or there's lots of reasons people will give up passwords or let somebody take 100,000 lines of code.
Yeah, let's start with Chris. Well, how does Meta view this?
How does Chris view this? It's a very valid point. The insider threat is certainly real. There are indictments to prove it. Every major frontier AI lab is going to have a robust insider threat program. But it is also important to remember, I think, that in order to build these models, you need a huge workforce. And that workforce comes from all over the world, and they're very talented people. And without them, these models just, quite frankly, just wouldn't exist. And so I don't think the challenge with AI, protecting AI intellectual property from the insider threat, is necessarily that much different than protecting, classic intellectual property outside of AI. Certainly the risk is a little bit higher, right? Because the asset is worth potentially billions of dollars that go into training it. But the fundamentals of an insider threat program to defend against it doesn't change all that much. In some cases, it might actually be easier because the environments where you train these things are very, very constrained. And even though you're scaled out on tens of thousands of GPUs, you might not need a certain number of people past a certain step in the process. And so it is certainly a valid issue, and it is not one that that anyone is going to solve overnight. But again, I don't think it's dramatically different than the insider threat against any other sort of sensitive intellectual property. The risks are certainly potentially a little bit higher, though.
Not just about theft of IP, but about somebody providing the tools to another country
Right.
to attack who knows who.
Right. I mean, this kind of, I'm not sure exactly what you mean in terms of like providing the tools, but if you mean like closed models being provided to someone else, there's lots of good research on this and analysis of, even if you were to take the latest and greatest frontier model and give it to an adversary, what would they be able to do with it? You'll find differing opinions of people. I probably fall a little bit closer to the side of it wouldn't be all that useful, but I think it's also important to remember that open weights have dramatically increased in capability over the last couple of years. And some of the best ones come from some of our biggest adversaries. And so it's a little bit different of a threat picture now versus 2023, where, the latest and greatest GPT-4 or whatever walked out the door. That's a much different story today when you have competing open weight models that are just as capable or more originating from an adversary.
That's the most optimistic thing I've heard about insider threats. About
You're welcome.
Is there anyone else in the audience who has a question? Just
Put this online as well. Hi, I'm Charity Whedon. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Geotech Center. My question is about export controls. I'm pleasantly surprised to see that as a tool that the U.S. can use for the downstream security effects of these dual-use systems. However, my question to you is, do you really feel today's export control system is fit for purpose for this really fast-moving target? And does it also take into account the economic security angle here as well? So just kind of your opinion on the role of export controls for the security or the cybersecurity of AI systems. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think my take here is something like, people sometimes talk about in the abstract, it matters to national security how much compute we have or how affordable our computers in the US versus competitors and adversaries and whatnot. And the cyber domain, to me, at least stands out as sort of one of the more salient domains to consider this, notwithstanding that maybe it's not that expensive at the moment to run things or a bottleneck. I can see a future where being able to run a lot of cyber agents at low cost is in fact, important for the strength and cyber competition of a country or not. So, I think the cyber domain, in my view, bolsters the case for thinking about chips as a strategic resource. And in terms of your question of, are we, there where we want to be in terms of the policy around this? A couple of thoughts I have there. Obviously it's been in the news lately about what chips or not should be exported in the first place. And, one comment I'd offer here is that, in my view, it's not just training that matters, and in fact, maybe trying to constrain training and ability is a little bit harder. But if inference is playing a growing role, then chips that are maybe even just good for, inference for running models is something to pay attention to in terms of whether we should or shouldn't export those. And, we've got some reporting out from CNAS and other places on sort of chip smuggling and whatnot, putting aside the question of what should we and shouldn't we export. I think there's room to have a lot more sort of innovative policies and effort and resourcing around identifying if chips are being smuggled or diverted and such things. And so, yeah, there's definitely, like, in my view, sort of somewhat shovel-ready policy solutions that would be great to see here in terms of, notwithstanding some of the questions about the security and limits of these, but, actually trying to do some more stuff around location verification of chips, for example, is something I'd be excited about.
Any other questions in the audience?
Yes, Caroline Ginmera for the Future Society. Thank you so much for this presentation and this talk. So I wanted to focus on policy recommendations and what the AI Action Plan tasked a few agencies in government to improve. So focusing on incident preparedness. So what would be your recommendation for the U.S. government, including the Center for AI Standards and Innovation, to work on to improve incident preparedness for cyber attacks?
Everybody's looking at me.
Don't jump in all at once.
Yeah, that's a very big and broad question, which makes it difficult to answer succinctly. So I'll try not to ramble. I don't know that I would put so much of the incident preparedness exactly on Casey. I think that they're kind of a bellwether for us to see what are the risks that we should be up against. What's the prospects at kind of a technical level. I think that there's a lot to be done. So we've talked a lot about how hard defense is in these cases, and in the spirit of come with solutions, not just problems. I think that since we have difficulties at the technical level, there are all sorts of other pieces of cyber defense that we should lean on more. These are things like resiliency, and so how quickly can we respond from attack, and how damaging can an attack can be is different from the ability to conduct the attack. And so that's where we can put a lot of efforts. And I would put that more in the DHS bucket, and maybe the CISA buckets, or the DOE buckets, to be like, what do we need to? How do we need to implement our systems? What are the risk analysis that we need to do up front, and the resilience measures we need to put in place so that when attacks happen or when mistakes happen, they're not especially damaging and we can recover from them quickly. The picture that I like to use in my own head is not like a great example technically, but it's kind of visualizes it well. As we integrate AI systems, we can de-skill the operators and change the operating interfaces. Imagine your self-driving car gets hacked and there's no steering wheel. You don't have the manual backup and you don't have the ability to take it over. We could imagine that across all of our critical infrastructure systems, where as we integrate AI, we become more familiar with it, we lose the ability to recover and be resilient in the face of attack. And it doesn't have to be that way. And so that's what I would start with.
Anyone else? Sir.
Yeah, so Chris Cugino, I'm from the Institute for AI Policy and Strategy. A quick kind of hypothetical for you guys. Let's pretend I'm a critical infrastructure operator. I have a decent budget. I'm very interested in defense. I specifically, obviously, I care about reliability of my systems more than like an IT, traditional IT network. I don't want my power utility or my turbine to shut down, right? So keeping those considerations in, what would you advise me for, what use case for AI, for cyber defense would you kind of advise me on, like vulnerability discovery or, network detection, response, or, whatever it might be? Or would you tell me to wait? And then what would you tell me to wait for? Should the systems be more reliable? Should the cost come down? Given all the considerations you said about prompt injection and the cost of inference and all of that. So what would you kind of tell me to do?
Yeah, I mean, again, to this, yeah, as you sort of pointed at, and my co-panelists have pointed at, there's this question about sort of what to do now versus sort of what to ask for to prepare for the future. I mean, I will say I think it's great that you brought up industrial control systems, because the reporting I've seen is that this intersection of AI, cyber, industrial control systems, like this is the sweet spot of things that China loves to look at and do research on and whatnot. So this question of what can AI models do in terms of finding vulnerabilities and securing industrial control systems. I mean, they're certainly looking at it, and so, you know, given that ICS systems are sort of unglamorous, I think it is worth thinking from the perspective of the, you know, US security community, making sure to do the same. So that's not an exact answer to your question, but that's at least one point I'd make.
I can certainly jump in here too. I would go with the latter. I'd say wait. If you look at all of the critical infrastructure compromises, they're like mostly laughably simple, right? It's simple authentication lapses, sometimes no authentication at all, very simple command injection vulnerabilities. And if you look at the operators of these utilities, they're clearly like, they're not in the business of fixing these vulnerabilities themselves. Like they're in the business of providing water and power and very like critical infrastructure. So I view this as more of like a software liability problem. Like there's a long tail of simple things that need to get cleaned up in those industries. And a lot of it is, you know, goes back to incentives to the vendors they're procuring their software from. And that's an unglamorous problem. And it's one we've been struggling with in cybersecurity for a very long time. And I'm not convinced that like AI is somehow the answer to that. Like even if you gave these critical infrastructure operators cheap, capable frontier AI capabilities on-site, on-prem, are they using that to patch the like third-party software they bought 15 years ago that's out of a patch lifecycle? Like probably not. Like there's probably better answers to that problem first before you go reaching for AI.
Yeah, I'd like to like maybe build on that in a different direction. I kind of want to look at those people who have their 15-year-old unpatchable, unmaintained software and be like, you guys have been using this in a dangerous situation and have figured out, in some cases, in some cases they haven't figured out any of the security of it, but sometimes they figure out how can we rely on this knowingly vulnerable software in a secure way. And I want to like kind of draw that out and understand if we do end up in the world where AI finds tons of vulnerabilities and everything is vulnerable, does that mean the world is over? Some people have figured out ways to get around that. And so I want to use that as like an inspiration also. And then going kind of in another speculative direction, one of the things that was in that list of 50 different things that make cyber what it is, that Jay Healy and Rob Jervis wrote together. One of them, it was the tactically fast and the operationally slow. Another one was the internet, or it has scale-free networks. And that's like these networks, some things connect to other things, and some of them have a lot of connections, some of them have less. And so there's this distribution of how many connections, how accessible is any given node. You can imagine if AI becomes really what people claim it to be, it reshaping that level of connections, where like when you train a thing, it's got everything that it needs to know in-house. It doesn't have to reach out for all these connections, or if it does reach out, it reaches out to like the one place, and then that reaches out to others. And that might be easier to defend in some senses. Now, I don't put infinite faith in air gapping, but I like it better than not air gapping sometimes. And so there are some opportunities here also potentially.
Another brief thought I'll offer is that if I'm anyone, and if I'm a critical infrastructure operator, there will certainly be people coming to me and telling me, yes, the answer is not wait. I have the solution for you here, and it's very important and urgent that you adopt my solution. And so I think making sure that there's a ecosystem of trusted, somewhat independent. There's a question here about what is the role of government here, maybe to actually help people navigate what's hype and what's not. I think is also an important public good to make sure is out there.
All right. Well, that is all the time that we have today. Thank you so much to Caleb, to Chris, to Andrew for giving us your time, and thank you so much to the audience for listening as well. Thank you.